moment my mother-in-law's face went white, I understood exactly how expensive silence can be. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, the calculated silence of someone who has been listening for 2 hours and finally has everything he needs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the Saturday afternoon when my wife told me her family wanted to celebrate our anniversary. My name is James Whitfield. I'm 51 years old. I teach mechanical engineering at a state university in Cincinnati, and until 14 months ago, I believed I had a solid marriage. 12 years with my wife, Adriana. A house in Hyde Park we'd renovated ourselves, a golden retriever named Chief, a son named Cooper who was 9 and obsessed with baseball. I thought we were doing fine. Not perfect, whose marriage is, but fine. Honest, grounded. What almost nobody in my life knew, including Adriana, was that I'd spent 3 years in Osaka teaching technical courses for a manufacturing consortium. 2009 to 2012. Right after my first marriage fell apart and before I'd rebuilt myself into something I recognized, those 3 years in Japan changed how I thought about patience, about reading a room, about the enormous gap between what people say and what they mean. And they'd made me fluent in Japanese, not tourist Japanese, not anime Japanese. Working, negotiating, arguing, laughing in Japanese fluent. When I met Adriana at a friend's housewarming in 2012, I was back in the States and done with explaining the Osaka years to people who couldn't picture it. She was beautiful and funny and spoke about her family in Kyoto with a warmth that got into my chest immediately. Her parents had moved to the US when she was 16, but the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, her grandmother on her mother's side, was still in Japan. She spoke Japanese at home with her parents whenever they visited. She never once asked me if I understood. I never volunteered that I did. It wasn't deceptive, not at first, it just never came up organically. By the time it would have felt natural to mention it. Mentioning it would have required explaining why I hadn't mentioned it earlier. And then we'd been together a year, and then 2. And it became this private thing I carried. Insurance, maybe, or just a habit of privacy I'd never quite shed after Osaka taught me that the most useful information is the kind nobody knows you have. The anniversary dinner was her parents' idea, my mother-in-law's specifically. Adriana mentioned it on a Thursday. Her parents wanted to take us to Orchid, a Japanese restaurant in Blue Ash that her father had been going to since it opened. Her grandmother was visiting from Kyoto, first time in 4 years. A real family celebration. Adriana seemed pleased, but a little tense in a way I'd learned not to examine too closely. I should have examined it. We arrived on a Saturday evening in March, the kind of cold that makes Cincinnati feel personal. Her parents were already seated at a large round table near the back, along with her grandmother, her mother's younger sister, and the sister's husband. 6 adults, 1 child. My son Cooper sat between me and his mother, looking at the menu like he was reading a legal document. My in-laws greeted me the way they always did, warmly enough to pass inspection, but with a formality that had never fully dissolved in 12 years. My father-in-law shook my hand. My mother-in-law touched my arm and smiled in a way that stopped just short of her eyes. Her grandmother gave me a slow nod that felt like an assessment rather than a greeting. The aunt and her husband were friendly. Genuine, I thought. At least them. For the first half hour, everything was in English. We talked about Cooper's baseball team, about a problem with the kitchen renovation my in-laws were doing, about the grandmother's flight from Kyoto. Normal dinner conversation. Good food, warm sake, the usual rhythms. Then Cooper got bored and started playing a game on his tablet, and the conversation shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, the way temperature drops gradually until you realize you're cold. My father-in-law said something in Japanese to my mother-in-law. She answered. Her sister said something that made them both laugh. The grandmother joined in, and then, without any formal decision that I could see, the table had switched entirely. Adriana joined them, and I was sitting in the middle of a Japanese conversation I was apparently not part of. I did what I'd learned in years of business dinners in Osaka. I smiled. I ate. I looked engaged and understood nothing. I poured myself more sake and let my expression say, "This is pleasant and I'm just happy to be here." but I was listening. The first 20 minutes were unremarkable. They talked about the grandmother's health, about a cousin's new job in Nagoya, about whether the restaurant's ramen was better before the ownership changed. Normal family talk. I relaxed slightly. Then my mother-in-law said in Japanese that the timing needed to move faster because her patience was running thin. My father-in-law said the attorney in Columbus had already filed the preliminary paperwork. An attorney in Columbus. Preliminary paperwork. I kept eating. My mother-in-law said that Adriana needed to stop hesitating. That a clean break was better than a slow one. That the house in Hyde Park had gone up significantly in value, and that my name on the deed was the complication they needed to resolve before anything could proceed. The aunt said something I didn't fully catch, something about it being hard because Cooper. My mother-in-law said Cooper would be fine. Children adjust. And then she said, and this is the part that I have replayed in my head so many times since that it has worn grooves. She said that I had been useful, but that useful things get replaced when something better comes along, in Japanese. At a dinner table where she believed I understood nothing, I picked up my sake glass and took a slow sip. My father-in-law asked about the timeline. Adriana answered, not meeting her mother's eyes. She said she needed until June. She said she wanted to handle it herself without it becoming ugly, without the lawyers taking over completely. Her mother said June was fine, but not a day later. She said the man in Kyoto. She used a name. A first name I won't put here. Someone I now know. Adriana had been in contact with since before our marriage started failing. Would not wait indefinitely. The grandmother said something quietly, something in a softer register that I only caught half of. But the word she used was giri, which means duty or obligation. She said something about giri and about family and about what Adriana owed the people sitting at this table. I set my fork down. Quietly, Cooper glanced up from his tablet, looked at me, looked back at the screen. He could always read my energy better than most adults. What I had understood in the last 40 minutes of listening to a conversation I was supposed to be invisible inside of was this. My wife was planning to divorce me. Her family had already retained legal counsel in Columbus. They had a timeline. There was someone else, a man in Japan, whose connection to Adriana predated whatever they decided to write off as a failing marriage, and the primary obstacle they were discussing, with me sitting 18 inches away eating sashimi, was the house. My name on the deed of the house we had renovated room by room over 11 years. I had two choices. I could excuse myself. Go to the car, drive home, and fall apart privately, and deal with this like an adult in the light of a different day. Or I could stay exactly where I was. My mother-in-law was saying something to Adriana about the deed, about whether I had ever put additional money into the renovation that might complicate the equity split. She used the word mendokusai, which means troublesome or a pain in the neck. She was asking whether I would be mendokusai about the house. I looked at her. I took a breath. And in conversational Osaka-inflected Japanese, I said, I don't think the house will be the complicated part. I think this conversation has been the complicated part. The table stopped. Not gradually, instantly, like someone had cut the power to the room. My mother-in-law stared at me. The color left her face slowly, then all at once. My father-in-law's hand froze on his sake cup. The aunt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The grandmother blinked twice, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read at all. Adriana had gone rigid in her chair. She was staring at the centerpiece. In Japanese, still conversational, I continued. I said that I had lived in Osaka from 2009 to 2012, that I had taught engineering to Japanese manufacturing teams and conducted negotiations across 3 facilities. That my Japanese was not perfect, but that it was, I thought, more than sufficient for a dinner conversation at a restaurant in Blue Ash, Ohio. My father-in-law found his voice first. He asked, in Japanese, how long I had been able to understand them. I told him the truth. I said always. I said that Adriana had never asked, and I had never seen a reason to volunteer it, and that I was increasingly grateful for that particular gap in our communication. I switched to English then because I wanted Cooper to understand if he happened to be listening, and because I wanted Adriana to understand that there would be no ambiguity in what came next. I said, I heard everything. The attorney in Columbus, the timeline, the equity discussion, the name I am not going to repeat at this table. I heard all of it, and what I want to know. Right now, sitting here in this restaurant where you brought me to celebrate a marriage that apparently at least half of this table knows is already over, is why. Not the legal why, not the financial why. Why I didn't deserve a conversation before you started talking to lawyers. The table was so quiet that I could hear the kitchen from across the room. Adriana said my name. I looked at her. She was crying, or close to it, in the way of someone who has been holding something too tight for too long and can feel it starting to slip. I had loved this woman. I still did, in the complicated and diminishing way you love someone whose shape has changed into something you no longer recognize. She said she hadn't known how to start the conversation. I told her that speaking Japanese in front of me for 40 minutes was also a choice about how to have a conversation. Her mother started to say something. I looked at her and she stopped. I picked up Cooper's jacket from the back of his chair. He had taken out one earbud and was watching me with the careful attention of a child who has learned that adult silences are load-bearing. I told him we were going to go get ice cream. I told him everything was okay. I was not sure that was true, but it was what a father says. I nodded to the table. I said in English that I hoped the food was good and that someone would get the check, and then we walked out. I took Cooper to Grater's on Erie Avenue. He got black raspberry chip. I got coffee and sat across from him while he ate and tried to figure out the shape of what had just happened. He asked if Mom and the grandparents were okay. I told him they were having a grown-up conversation and that sometimes grown-up conversations were hard. He said that Grandma had looked like she'd seen a ghost. I said sometimes that happens when people are surprised. He accepted this with the pragmatism of a 9-year-old and asked if we could stop at Walgreens on the way home to get baseball cards. We did. He found a Mike Trout he'd been looking for. He showed it to me 3 times in the car. I told him it was a great card each time and meant it less each time and felt terrible about that. We got home around 9. Adriana wasn't back yet. Chief met us at the door. I put Cooper to bed, answered his questions about whether Mom was coming home with a yes that I was fairly sure was true, and sat on the edge of his bed until he fell asleep. Then I went downstairs and called my college roommate, who was an attorney specializing in commercial real estate, but who knows enough about family law to tell me what I needed to know that night. I told him everything in order, without edits. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a lot for a Saturday." I told him I needed a family law attorney first thing Monday. He said he knew a woman in Mason who was as good as it got in southwestern Ohio. He texted me her information before we even hung up. Adriana came home at 11:15. She came into the living room where I was sitting and stood in the doorway. She was not a person I hated. She was not a villain. She was someone who had made decisions in a particular direction and had let too much time pass before reversing course. And now the situation had reversed course for her instead. I asked her how long. She said she'd been unhappy for about 3 years, that she'd been corresponding with someone in Kyoto for 18 months, that nothing physical had happened while we were married. And I chose to believe her because I needed one thing in that night to remain uncomplicated. I asked why she hadn't come to me. She said she was afraid of what I'd say. I told her that the answer to that was worse than anything I might have said. She started to say something about the house. I told her to stop. I told her that the house was for Monday and the attorney, and that tonight I needed her to go upstairs and be available when Cooper woke up at 6, because that was still our job regardless of everything else. She went upstairs. I sat in the living room until 2 in the morning. The kitchen still smelled like the coffee I'd made that morning. Chief slept against my feet. I thought about Osaka, about the restaurant in Namba where I used to eat alone on Friday nights and practice my kanji and talk to the chef about baseball, which he loved, and engineering, which he did not understand but found interesting. I thought about how those 3 years had felt like losing everything and turned out to be where I'd rebuilt the specific version of myself that walked into a housewarming in 2012 and met a beautiful woman whose laugh sounded like something worth rearranging a life for. I thought about the look on my mother-in-law's face when I'd spoken. I thought about Mendokusai. I turned out to be more Mendokusai than she expected. The attorney in Mason was named Patricia Ose, and she was exactly what my roommate had promised. She had a corner office full of light and a quality of attention that made you feel like your problem was both serious and solvable. I told her everything. She took notes on a legal pad in a handwriting so small it looked like a different language. When I finished, she said, "The good news is that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, and the House will be divided fairly given both parties' financial contributions. The less good news is that equitable does not always mean equal, and the specifics of what both of you put in over 12 years will need documentation." I told her I had spreadsheets. I had kept running records of the renovation costs going back to the first contractor estimate in 2014. I had receipts, contracts, permit applications, payment records. I'd been an engineer for 30 years. I documented things the way other people breathe. She looked at me for a beat and said, "You're going to be okay." I want to tell you that I believed her immediately. I didn't. But I did eventually. The divorce took 14 months. It was not clean, mostly because the Columbus attorney my in-laws had retained was not in the business of clean. They contested the equity split. They tried to complicate the custody arrangement, claiming my work schedule made me less available than Adriana. My attorney countered with my actual schedule, my Cooper's actual school pickup records over 4 years, and a statement from his baseball coach about which parents showed up and how often. Cooper's baseball coach noted that I had not missed a single game in 3 seasons. The judge noted this too. We came out of it with what I would call a fair result for Cooper and a harder result for everyone else. He spends the school year primarily with me because Adriana accepted a position in Kyoto. That was not a decision I expected, or that I fully understand even now. She sees him in the summers and over winter break, and she has been, in this regard, as present as distance allows. We communicate about him in English, briefly and factually, which is the register we both seem to trust now. The house is still mine. I bought out her share based on what the attorneys agreed was her documented contribution. I had receipts going back 11 years. It mattered my mother-in-law does not contact me. My father-in-law sent me one email 6 months after the divorce was finalized, which said only that he hoped Cooper was well. I replied that Cooper was excellent. We have not been in contact since. The aunt sent me a Christmas card. I am still not sure what to make of this. Here is what I know now that I did not know clearly enough before. Trust your gut about the things that don't add up. I had noticed over those last 3 years that Adriana took phone calls in other rooms more often than she used to, that she seemed to be somewhere slightly behind her own eyes during family dinners, that there was a quality to her patience with me that had shifted from genuine to performed. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself that marriages have rhythms, and ours was just in a quieter one. I should have trusted what I was noticing. Documentation is not cynicism, it is clarity. I kept renovation spreadsheets because I am an engineer who cannot not keep records, not because I suspected I would need them in a courtroom. But those records protected my son's home. If you share a life with someone, and you share finances and you share property, knowing exactly what you've contributed is not distrust. It is simply knowing. Ask for help sooner than you think you need it. The call I made to my roommate that Saturday night, before I had processed even 10% of what had happened, was the most useful thing I did in the entire 14 months that followed. I was embarrassed to make it. I made it anyway. If I had waited until I felt ready, I would have lost 2 weeks minimum. There are things about this story that I have not fully resolved, maybe never will. I wonder sometimes whether the outcome would have been different if I had told Adriana, somewhere in those first years, that I spoke Japanese. Maybe that knowledge would have changed the texture of the relationship. Maybe she would not have drifted toward a different version of her life if she had known the man she was married to had made his own difficult crossing into her family's language and come out the other side. I don't know. I keep coming back to it, and I keep not knowing. Cooper is 10 now. He started middle school this fall, which he describes as fine with the particular emphasis of someone who has decided to survive rather than enjoy. He talks to his mother twice a week on video. He misses her more than he says, in the way of a kid who has learned that some feelings are too inconvenient to advertise. We're working on that in family therapy, which has been one of the better decisions of the past year. He asked me a few months ago why Mom had to go so far away. I said that sometimes people have to go where their life is. That it didn't mean she didn't love him. He sat with that for a while and then asked if I missed Japan. I told him I had some good years there. That it changed me in ways that turned out to matter. He asked if I would teach him Japanese. I said yes before he finished asking. We do 20 minutes every morning before school. He's picked it up with the openness of someone who doesn't yet know that learning a language is supposed to be difficult. He thinks it's interesting, which is the best possible starting point. Last week he said his first full sentence, unprompted. He wanted me to know, in Japanese, that he was hungry and that the cereal we had was not acceptable. I told him, in Japanese, that he was absolutely right and that we would get better cereal. He looked at me for a moment and then he grinned. This kid, this completely irreplaceable kid, who is the fact of my life, I feel most clearly on the days when everything else is blurred. And he said, Dad, when did you get so good at Japanese? I told him it was a long story, that I'd tell him the whole thing when he was older. He said, is it a good story? I thought about a dinner table in March, about Osak going cold, about the specific sound a room makes when 40 minutes of private conversation get answered in the language that conversation was supposed to be hidden behind, about walking out of that restaurant with my son and the night air and the knowledge that whatever happened next, I had not been the fool they thought I was sitting across from. I told him yes. I told him it was actually a pretty good story. He said he couldn't wait to hear it. Neither could I, in a way. The story I thought I was living turned out to be a different one. Smaller in some ways. Quieter. But mine the way very few things had felt completely mine before. The house. This kid. 20 minutes of Japanese every morning before school. It's enough. Some days it's more than enough. I've thought a lot about why things ended the way they did. Not the legal part. The attorneys sorted that out over 14 months with the thoroughness that attorneys tend to bring when there's a house involved. I mean the deeper why. The cause and effect chain that started long before that Saturday dinner at Orchid and ended with Cooper asking me to teach him Japanese at 6:30 in the morning. Here's what I've come to understand. The people at that table made a calculation. They looked at me, a quiet engineering professor, someone who showed up to family dinners and didn't make noise and smiled at the right moments. And they decided I was the kind of man who could be managed. That my politeness was the same thing as passivity. That because I didn't push back on the surface, there was nothing underneath. That calculation was wrong. But I also have to be honest about my part in it. I kept the Osaka years private not out of strategy but out of habit. I had built a version of myself that traveled light, that didn't volunteer information that wasn't asked for. In a marriage, that's not a virtue. Adriana and I had drifted into a relationship where I thought I understood her and she thought she understood me, and we were both wrong. And neither of us said so clearly enough or early enough. That's not her fault alone. It's not mine alone either. It's what happens when two people stop asking real questions and start just managing the surface of things. What I know now is that silence has a cost, not the useful kind of silence. The listening, the observing, the patience I learned in Osaka that turned out to matter enormously on one specific Saturday night in March. I mean the silence between people who are supposed to be honest with each other. That silence doesn't protect anything. It just gives misunderstanding more room to grow. Cooper is 10. He is learning Japanese 20 minutes at a time, and he doesn't know yet what those lessons are really about. He thinks it's interesting and a little funny that his dad speaks a language most of his classmates have never heard outside of video games. What he doesn't know. What I'll tell him when he's old enough to hear it without it becoming something he has to carry is that those 20 minutes every morning are the thing I'm most proud of choosing. Not the divorce outcome, not the house, not the spreadsheets that held up in court. The fact that I'm sitting across the table from my kid, teaching him that the world is bigger than the version of it you were handed, and that the skills that feel useless in one chapter of your life have a way of becoming exactly what you need in the next one. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's the long accumulation of small choices, keeping records, showing up to every baseball game, making the call you're embarrassed to make, telling the truth even when you're not sure how it'll land. Those things compound. The people at that dinner table made a different set of choices, and those compounded too, in a different direction. I don't have bitterness about it, not anymore. What I have is clarity, which is worth considerably more, and I have Cooper, who asked me last week if his Japanese was getting better and whom I was able to tell honestly that yes, it really is.